So when you stuck your hands up that so many of you are educators, I just was overcome. Because the collective commitment to children, their development, and this world that's in this room is unfathomable and incredibly inspiring. So I want to begin with you, each and every one of you, acknowledging the depth of your own commitment and also some of the suffering you bear because of that commitment. I'm not going to be talking about research on children, except of the older kind, which is folks like you. Now I'm going to see if we can launch this PowerPoint. Tonight you have two of me. There's the me at the podium, and then about a quarter of a second later, there's the me on the screen. And if you try to watch the screen, the first experiential exercise, first mindfulness exercise, if you will, of the event is to see whether or not you experience confusion when you try to look at me on the screen over there. Because in the laboratory, if we want to screw someone's understanding up, you use delayed auditory feedback. Now you notice, and you won't be able to do anything, but at least over here I'm smaller but in sync. So that's already part of common sense contemplation. So what's the context of what I want to talk to you about tonight? You've heard this phrase innumerable times. Put on your mask first. And I'll qualify it, or at least in parallel. This event is dedicated to the notion that we can assist children in their flourishing through a variety of means, including contemplative techniques, something called mindfulness. But one of the questions that Maria's already floated for the group is, what about the adults in concert with those children? So what I want to do is ask you, if you're going to put on your mask, what are you going to do? You're going to learn about quiet. You're going to learn about disturbance. You're going to learn about quiet in disturbance. You're going to learn about creativity and a generative embrace of the possible, and to let limits be as porous as possible and as solid as necessary. You will learn to become safety. In short, we can learn to parent ourselves. There's a relationship between internal exploration and discovery and self-care. One of the things that Victor alluded to was that when I was physically challenged and could barely breathe, I got in the habit of watching my breath. And it wasn't until many years later that I realized, going to a meditation retreat, I was paying for the privilege of simply being grateful to be alive. This February, there was a really interesting article in the New York Times. Relax, you'll be more productive. And in fact, there's a good deal of empirical evidence for this. This is an experiment that was published in a top psychology journal, Psychological Science, from the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. The task is you're going to see a series of numbers about once a second. They might be up to 7 numbers, and your job is to repeat them back in a backward sequence over and over again. It's called a digit span, backward digit span task. They gave this to individuals, undergraduates, and then they had them take a walk. Half of them were randomly assigned to walk in an arboretum. Half were assigned to walk in downtown Ann Arbor. And downtown Ann Arbor is not Manhattan. But if you look over here, the group that took the walk in the arboretum did much better when they were retested a short time later. This is called the effects of attention restoration, and it goes back to William James. So, attention restoration theory says the following. We all know from our direct experience we have limited attentional resources. How many emails can you answer in a day? But you can restore your attentional resources after they're depleted. So it goes like this: interacting with environments that are rich with inherently fascinating stimuli involuntarily invokes attention modestly. And that allows directed attention mechanisms a chance to replenish. So you lucky ducks here, you get to see scenes like this from downtown. You could just have a nice slideshow. And I know sometimes this is not what you want to see. But actually look at it. There are all these spirals, interacting circles. It's dynamic. This is that the requirement for directed attention in such environments is minimal, and attention is captured in a kind of bottom-up, it's inherently interesting fashion by the environment itself. So the logic is, after interaction with a natural environment, one's able to perform better on tasks that depend upon directed attention. And a lot of school is a lot of directed attention. Now consider this scene. Isn't it lovely? Just kind of gives you a warm and fuzzy feeling. And this I snapped with my iPhone this morning. And I'm particularly intrigued by this guy. So unlike natural environments, urban environments contain bottom-up stimulation, car horns, moving vehicles, that capture attention dramatically. Actually, you have to overcome this hard capture of attention in order to keep on with your goal. You're subject to distraction. You have to fight your way through traffic, ignore everything that's clamoring for your attention, and this consumes very self-same attentional resources. Now, there are other impacts of the environment that are more subtle, that might play inside. So here's another experiment recently published in Psych Science. You take a bunch of undergraduates and you randomly assign them. Assume we had on the stage here a box 5 feet by 5 feet by 5 feet, and then a chair outside the box. You get it randomly assigned to sit in a chair in the box or outside the box. Random assignment. And then what we're going to do is we're going to give you a creativity test. And it turns out the folks who sat outside the box did significantly better than the folks who were inside the box. So this phrase, thinking outside the box, is actually not a metaphor. But what would have happened if these participants had closed their eyes? This is kind of where it goes. And now we go below the surface. Here is a proposition. The world within is a natural environment, and all that that entails. Beautiful living forms. We often call them thoughts. Unexpected hazards. We often call them traumatic memories. Safe harbors. Self-care. Self-compassion. Peacefulness. Mirages. There are too many to name. Structures built up over hundreds of millions of years are reptilian, amphibian, reptilian, and mammalian heritage. You guys are nature. So now we talk about a view in psychology and neuroscience. Because if we're now talking about natural phenomena, I'm going to give you some quotes from Larry Barcelou, who wrote a very influential chapter in the Annual Review of Psychology called Grounded Cognition. It's been cited about 700 times in just a few years. So despite what you see in newspapers and magazines about locations of areas of the brain that light up because of neuroimaging findings, fixed representations do not exist in the brain. Instead, multiple systems implement perception, action, and cognition, where each system is capable of residing in one of infinitely many continuous states. What grade level is that sentence? Over the course of learning, states of these systems become coupled to each other and with the environment that are effective in achieving our goals. This is a kind of view of embodied, grounded cognition where our lived experience is actually coupled with our learning. We don't have pure symbolic knowledge. It's always got a trace to the circumstances under which we learned it, to the sense experience of it, and to the sense experience of connections we make internally. So I'm going to give you a profound metaphor, and I could speak for an hour about all the ways that this metaphor is wholly inadequate. But a wonderful neuroscientist, Catherine Tolan-Baudry, presented this at a brain dynamical neuroscience meeting, and I take it from her. This is something called a boid. That's not just a New York way of saying bird, but these are particles that are following very simple rules interacting with other particles. So they either come close or stay away because of their characteristics. This is the way birds flock, the way schools of fish. They don't all have an awareness of the whole school. They're just paying attention to a very local environment, but there's a kind of mass action. So here, you're going to see each particle has a very thin trace, but the bright trace is the ways in which they build together. And, our neuronal circuitry that's responsible for causing our body to move and things to coalesce comes from network convergences of mass action of hundreds of millions, if not billions, of neurons synchronously firing. So the rules that single neurons follow are much more complex than this. But this is a dynamic metaphor. So you can think that when a child is trying to do something, the state they may be in that particular moment is different than the state they're going to be in a moment later. And maybe it's going to make sense to wait. And this is the average non-invasive imaging for 20 people's connection of the brain. So you have this dynamic activity, and this activity goes all over the brain. But the actual anatomy it would just be black. So this is this extraordinarily dynamic, evanescent system. And Francisco Varela and Antoine Lutz did an experiment about 12 years ago, published in PNAS, that illustrates how the same individual, time to time, can be remarkably different in terms of their brain state, even when they're doing the same task. And I want for this to be a teachable moment regarding what neuroscience can potentially contribute in the moment to the way you interact with students and each other. So the task is you're going to see random dots on a computer monitor, and they're going to, at some point in time, become a random dot stereogram. And those of you may have seen the books Magic Eye, or these fun images where if you defocus your eyes, you sort of see a 3D pop out from what looks like a repeating pattern or noise. Children love these things. It's very hard to get them to actually achieve seeing the 3D image. So here, the pop out is very boring. It's not like a dolphin or a unicorn or something. It's actually just a box. So the experiment is, at some point in time, you're going to see the random dot stereogram, but you have to then press a button when you see it pop out. But the kicker here is that you are asked to say, how prepared was your mind to see the pop out? If you do this enough times, sometimes you have a sense that your mind, you're distracted a little, or you're looking at the content of the screen rather than defocusing. So this is transient evidence for a prepared mind, for a single individual who is reporting a time when they felt prepared to see the 3D pop out. The stimulus occurs over here. But before the stimulation, the brain pattern has built up to actually a very similar pattern to the pattern that is present when they see the pop out. Here's another trial. This is when they said, I wasn't prepared at all. And now their reaction is later in time, and this final pattern is very similar, but it takes much longer to converge. So if you have a student who's paying attention to, the bright light in the back of the room when you're talking, what brain state are you talking to? This fluxes on the order of a few seconds. So you may have, essentially, a different system a moment later. Somewhere in what I've just said, there may be something to consider pedagogically. What is meditation? In Sanskrit, the word bhavana means to cultivate. In Tibetan, gom means to become familiar. So really, what we're talking about is a process of cultivating familiarization with the world within, with the nature of your mind as you experience it. Which is quite different than the specific technique one might use during the time you're going to spend in a specific meditation practice. If we ask, well, what is this project that we undertook? What is it that, as researchers, we can direct our efforts to? We could ask, what do people do when they meditate? Well, that's a really interesting and difficult, and I would argue nearly intractable question. Because any of you who've spent some time meditating, you know that there's a great deal of variability when you ostensibly are doing the same practice. Even within a day, if you're on a retreat, you might have the most distracted, bored, antsy sitting of your life, and an hour later, you're just really chill. You doing the same thing? And who knows how to report what you are in fact doing? So in science, we report the instructions we give people. But we're just beginning to think about how to measure, to assess from a kind of first-person phenomenological perspective what people do and how that develops over time. and how it shifts across time. But there's another question which is eminently tractable, and that is, what do you do differently having spent some time meditating? And of course, these are recursive. So in the rest of the talk, I'm going to emphasize the efforts we've made to try to speak about what we do differently because we've meditated. So here is Richie Davidson, and here I am. And Victor wasn't making it up. There we were back in the 70s when Richie and I worked together on a daily basis for 14 years. Linda's. And Richie couldn't go to the third Mind and Life meeting and very kindly asked me on almost no notice, would I like to go to Dharamsala? And I was finally, having committed to graduate school at an elderly age, so happy to oblige him. So 3 weeks later, I was bailing on a protein biochemistry final exam and saying, you see, Your Holiness, on this graph, and I've still got the same green laser point. In 2009, I had the good fortune with Adele Diamond, who's here, to be at a Mind and Life meeting on attention and memory and cognition, and I was able to present initial results from this project to His Holiness. And again, here is Richie and I in October with His Holiness at Rockefeller. So when we went to Dharamsala, when I filled in for Richie in 1990, I was rooming with Francisco Varela. And Francisco is really the father, and intellectual father in many ways, of the dialogue between Buddhist psychology and philosophy and practice and neuroscientific psychological research. He's one of the founders of the Mind and Life Institute. And he said, well, you know, we're two old EEGers. We were rooming together. We should do something with the monks in Dharamsala. And we talked to Alan Wallace. This is Alan in 1992 and Alan in 2009 at that same meeting. And he'd been a monk for 14 years and said, you know, I've got this idea. Focused attention meditation, not so esoteric. Neuroscientists study attention. Why don't we just find some really adept practitioners in India and test them? I, was in graduate school. I had nothing else to do. So we brought about 1,500 pounds of equipment to India, nothing like lugging lead-acid dry cells across the entire globe because power is very unreliable. And we set about doing a field research project to investigate the effects of Tibetan mental training on emotion and cognition way back in the early 90s. And we even hooked my friend Greg Simpson up at one of the Mind and Life meetings, so we had a kind of Julia Child, here, Your Holiness, this is what recording EEG looks like. And there's Francisco, Alan, Adam Engel, Joan Halifax, Jimpo when he was still in robes. And why is everybody smiling? Because His Holiness is a bit of a geek, and he was saying, how do you calibrate the horizontal time axis so you can know the frequency of the waves? That's what he was saying here. So we took these goat trails and encountered remarkable people and spent time with Alan as a translator. He speaks Tibetan with a Lhasa accent. And this fellow I'm showing you because he had been tortured by the Chinese. He couldn't see well. He couldn't hear. He has a hearing aid. Most of the monks said, why are you talking to me? I don't know anything. And if you want to know what's up with meditation, meditate. And they also said, how are you going to measure the mind? It's the space in which phenomena occur. But he talked about his whole toolkit of different practices depending upon his mind state. And he was very humble and matter-of-fact about his bliss and happiness and his despair, about his lethargy and his clarity. And I still show his photo because the inspiration of that sort of craftsman-like cabinet maker and his toolkit is a perspective on working with one's own mind, which really is a certain kind of common sense contemplation. Despite the elaborate training and aspects of Tibetan Buddhist work that he's done, the way he was able to relate to us was eminently, intimately direct. Here we're giving a task to a senior monk in a Neolithic stone hut that he had helped build, where he did his practice. So this is an attention task. And we also presented films and recorded facial expression. I'll be telling you more about that. And recorded EEG. And why are these guys laughing? Here's Francisco Ritchie's back here. They're laughing because we were measuring the mind with something on the head. Interesting. The cross-cultural issues involved in trying to do this project are written up in this chapter in this book. And finally, we had a talk about the nature of compassion by a man who was deeply inspiring. And we asked him, what's the relationship between sadness and compassion? Because people are moved by others' suffering. And he said, sadness can be catalytic, but one has to love the conditions that give rise to the suffering almost as a mother loves her child in order to generate the insight into the causes and conditions and web of interdependencies that give rise to what you're seeing. So you cannot push away that suffering. You have to see it. But these guys may always have been extraordinary. They may be in retreat on the mountain because they were the talented folks from birth, and now they got a chance to practice their craft. So we need to do a longitudinal study to find this out, and that's what we've done. And also it'll be a little more convenient to use culturally validated stimuli and not have to drag so much stuff up the mountain. But you'll see what we did drag. So the project that Victor alluded to, the Shambhala project, has 4 overarching aims. Can attention be trained through focused attention practice? Can training in loving kindness, compassion, and other beneficial aspirations support attention and improve emotion regulation? Are improvements in attention related to psychological function? And this short little ditty, what are the subjective, behavioral, neural, and physiological correlates of such training? I mean, you could just say that in one sentence, and I'll be here till, my bones will be still giving this talk, and who knows when. It is not going to fail to be a work in progress for many years. So, Alan being our partner in this from the beginning. Now it's 2007. We first talked about this in 1990. So he taught 2 3-month retreats. We started talking about what we wanted to do in 2003, and it took a long time to get money, and we had a lot of time to talk about, well, if you're going to meditate, what are all the things that are going to be impacted? And that's kind of like, well, you can become a parent. What do we want to look at? It's every aspect of your life if you're going to take an intensive training up. So we found individuals who were willing to be randomly assigned to one of 2 3-month-long residential retreats. This took place in the spring and fall of 2007. And we had 60 participants who were chosen from 142 applicants. And groups were matched on meditation experience, ethnicity, age, sex, and a whole host of psychological and cognitive performance variables. We even shipped laptops to to everyone all over the world, including Mexico. And we actually managed to get the laptops back with data. We had people turning their bedrooms and closets into cognitive science laboratories and use the same software on the little computers that we do in the laboratory. So what is Alan training? Two complementary strands, focusing the mind and opening the heart. And we've talked about both of those as part of the cornerstone of the commitments of this meeting. So for focused attention, there is a kind of triune set of attributes to pay particular attention to. Relaxation, stability, and a kind of vivid perception, perceptual clarity. And the specific techniques, many of you are familiar with mindfulness of breathing. That was the preponderant technique. And everybody sort of began with that. But you can also take the stability of attention that you might generate through practicing mindfulness of breathing, and instead of having a tactile sensory object, you can hold your attention to the whole field of the arising of mental phenomena. So, a day at the movies. Also, a more subtle technique, finding the invariance in your experience, becoming aware of your awareness. The 4 immeasurables, which we seek to measure, but they're called immeasurables because they should be able to be cultivated to an immeasurable extent. Loving kindness, the wish for others and self to be happy, and find the causes of happiness. Compassion, the wish for yourself and others to be free from suffering and the causes of suffering. Empathetic joy, really embracing the success and well-being of others, countering jealousy and envy. And equanimity, which really has to do with the diminishing of a sense of distance, whether someone is close to you or far from you. So what do we expect? Well, improved ability to focus. That would seem to be what you might reasonably expect would come from 500 hours of focused attention meditation. But what is it that you do that might train your focused attention? Is it that you rigidly hold your mind on an object? Or is it that you practice with a sense of generosity the fact that your mind wanders, you notice it, you notice the conditioning of the wandering, and as you would take a toddler across the street, you gently bring your mind back. How many people have said, I can't meditate, I have thoughts? You know, it's kind of like, that'd be like, I can't go outside, there's weather. So in the training of gently reorienting your attention, thousands of times, you can actually learn, as our first, the choir director said, as you believe your life will flow, if you stop saying, oh shit, excuse me, I'm off my object, and just say, here we go, here we go. That's a training. That's why we call it meditation practice. But there are many other features of comportment that happen when you're trying to do mindfulness of breathing. One of them is that you're agreeing to sit still till the gong rings. This is already a training in response inhibition. You know, you want to get up? Not time. You could just watch that thought. So there's a whole lot about the gross behavioral change of agreeing to sit for a period of time that already is its training. My friend Paul Grossman and I came up with the term the Tuchus effect, which is really reflects you sit on the cushion. It's already a kind of training. What does increased access to experience mean? Well, if you're becoming more aware of the flora and fauna of your internal environment, you may notice some weeds, you may notice a beautiful wildflower. Things that ordinarily escape your attention. Now, because we've taken the busyness and stimulation out of the way, you find that a whole host of phenomena arise and pass away. That can help you discern when your feelings change in response to an emotional event sooner than you might otherwise. I am not angry becomes, I'm angry. This is what anger feels like. Faster recovery from provocation suggests that maybe if you're more aware of what it is that's happening, you will decatastrophize what is happening, in which case you don't add fuel to the fire. And ultimately that results in a diminution of destructive tendencies. These are good things. These are our hypotheses of what we're going to find from this training. So we did a whole bunch of things, and I don't have time to tell you about much of what we've done, but I'll just sort of say we've done daily experience questionnaires, so we have mood state dynamics for every day of 3 months, significant events, we have meditation logs, we have a whole battery of self-report questionnaires that we combined together, and we conducted structured interviews at the end of the second retreat. We have attention-related laboratory tasks, attention, emotion, interaction tasks, emotional tasks. We had people meditate so we could record their brain activity and physiology and actually begin to ask some questions about what happens when you meditate. And we have a host of, somewhere along the line there, that's what we did. These are the measures. We have 88 channels of brain activity, autonomic measures like heart rates, conductance, respiration, blood pressure. We made loud noises and had people's eye blink measured when they were in the presence of emotional stimuli. We have performance, reaction time, accuracy. We scored facial expressions of emotion. We do thematic analysis of interviews. And we have a host of biomarkers. And then we had a follow-up at 5 months and 15 months. And with this new money that we're very grateful from the Templeton Foundation, we're going to have funds to look at people 6 years after this training and really see what the impact has been on their lives. So here we're on to Shambhala Mountain Center where we did this project. Here's the meditation lodge. This was a meditation room. Here's Alan now in his grayness and the second retreat. Below that room, we had a dorm which we converted into 2 university-grade laboratories. This is going to become a subject room. This is a control room. And now, instead of bringing all that equipment up the mountain in Dharamsala, we brought all this from Davis. Built our laboratory. Here we're hooking someone up. They're ready to do a task. And we can monitor EEG here. We see what they see. This is the video monitor. We have this unobtrusive video camera. It was obtrusive over here, but when you cover it with that speaker, you can't see it. And we had a blood lab, so we could process blood that we took. So we measured many questionnaires having to do with psychological function, and we combine them into a measure of adaptive functioning, which involves improvements in all the items on the left and decreases in the items on the right. And when you add these together, the control group, which was flown to the retreat center every time, beginning, middle, and end of the first 3-month retreat. So we randomly assign these people to 2 3-month retreats. The people in the second 3-month retreat, they're the control group for the first 3-month retreat. They're the same self-selected individual. There's the 2 matched groups. And we now give them the same procedures, test them in the same laboratory conditions. And they have no change beginning and end of the retreat, period. But the retreatants have a significantly improved adaptive psychological function value, which is maintained at the 5-month follow-up. Don't have 15-month follow-up data for you yet. When the control group did their own retreat, we have a perfect replication of this pattern. These are 2 independent samples. But you could say these guys were really invested. They had a lot of time on it. They were trying to suss out what we want from these questionnaires. So we need to look for relations between these questionnaire values and other things. So here are pictures of chromosomes. The ends of the chromosomes are your telomeres. Telomeres are the sequences of DNA that the DNA replication complex binds to. And because the DNA replication complex binds to the ends of your chromosomes, it cannot replicate the place where it binds. It replicates below. So every single time your cells divide, your chromosomes get a little bit shorter. The ends of your chromosomes get too short. Cells can't divide. And that actually is related to your longevity. But there's an enzyme, telomerase, which restores these shortened ends of your chromosomes. And Liz Blackburn, one of our collaborators, won the Nobel Prize for that discovery. So this was an idea that I thought was wholly outlandish when it was first suggested to me, that we look at telomerase and meditators. I mean, this is molecular biology, and we're talking about meditation, and how is this connected? So in a paper that was published in Psychoneuroendocrinology with Tanya Jacobs, who sort of took the lead on this analysis in collaboration with Alyssa Epple at UC San Francisco, we found that the retreat group at the end of 3 months of meditation had 30% more telomerase than the control group. But the real question is, does the level of telomerase relate to psychological change? Well, in the control group, this is the amount of telomerase, and this is change in perceived control. These are items from Carol Riff's well-being scale. Perceived control, or environmental mastery. You know, if a parent has a child with special needs, their perceived control goes through the floor. When your kid is doing well, you know, out of the house, self-supporting, I think you have a higher perceived control, but I don't know that experience yet. However, there's a relationship of improvements in a sense of environmental mastery in the retreat group, such that the higher the experienced change from beginning to end of the retreat of environmental mastery, the greater the level of telomerase. And this is much stronger even on the question of a sense of your purpose in life. Purpose in life is kind of coming up like roses everywhere as being incredibly important for well-being, for longevity, for having a meaningful existence. So there's no relationship in the control group. You know, this is kind of the correlation that got the paper published. What is up with this? We were not able to have measures of change in telomerase for change in psychology because we couldn't build the blood lab fast enough at the beginning of the project. So we're replicating that now with folks at Spirit Rock Meditation Center in 1 month Vipassana retreats. And we'll see what we get when we have change for change. We also have just recently published in Health Psychology, again, work spearheaded by Tanya Jacobs, of changes in a self-report measure of mindfulness, the 5-factor mindfulness questionnaire by Ruth Baer, that individuals at the end of the retreat who changed the most, who improved the most on this self-reported measure of what we call self-report measure of mindfulness. I'm hesitant to call what it measures mindfulness. It has 3 facets: mindful acting, acting with awareness; mindful observing, this non-judgmental sense of careful noting of features of your experience; and not reacting. You have an experience, you don't have a secondary reaction to the fact of the experience. Those are the items that differentiate the folks who improve the most, the top quartile. Actually, they have, this is the folks who improve the most, and they have lower cortisol at the end of the retreat in the afternoon, and there's actually an increase in cortisol for the folks who change the least. Think about it, 3 months. You know, if we spent 3 months in this room, you know, just building a community, and then we said, okay, now go back to your life. There are a lot of stressful consequences for the resumption of, you know, you've changed a lot, but who is going to perceive this and what's it going to be like? So there's an interplay between the way you hold the changing flux and nature of your experience and its stress on you. So I've got about 15 minutes to do about half an hour of stuff. So we'll talk briefly. What about attention? Well, we made a really boring task. Because if you're going to ask people to sit with their minds for hundreds of hours, and you want a good test. So we have a dot, and this is work by Catherine McLean, who did her PhD dissertation developing these tasks. There's a certain community in which she is an infamous person. You get a long line, and it's on the screen for about 1/10 of a second. Goes off, and then maybe you get a short line. 90% of the time, you get a long line. But we make it really, really hard because we take that short line and we keep making it for every single person. We take like 15 minutes out of the experiment and we say, okay, we're going to establish your visual perception threshold, and we're going to make the short line longer and longer and longer until you can't tell if it's a long line or a short line, but we're going to keep asking you to make the distinction. And when you start having no ability to tell whether it's long or short, we'll make it a tiny bit shorter. And then only about 75% of the time can you tell whether it's long or short, and we'll say, great, we're ready to go. That's the perceptual discrimination we're going to ask you to make every 2 seconds for the next 32 minutes. Are you with me? Would you like to do that task? So, we found, and this is data from the second retreat, that in multiple testings there was this classic vigilance decrement. It's kind of well established from studies from the Second World War of radar operators. How long can you look at a boring screen for a detection of a rare, random event that's not that different than what you see all the time? You can do this for 5 or 10 minutes, but there's this classic decrement of vigilance called, believe it or not, the Vigilance Decrement. So at the mid-test, this Vigilance Decrement, this is the first 16 minutes, gets flatter, and it gets flatter yet after 3 months of training. So you might say, they got better at sustained attention. But there's actually something very interesting. This is not due to just being better at sustained attention. Their visual perceptual threshold, unbeknownst to us, had changed during the course of the meditation retreat, and now they could see more sharply. They had this quality of perceptual vividness, and so now it was an easier task. And when an attention task gets easier, it kind of pops out more. It actually requires fewer attentional resources. So this is actually not what we were expecting. But here's the
data, at the beginning they were matched, but they were matched at an easier threshold. But there are these significant differences between the control group and the retreat group, such that the shorter the line means you can see a shorter amount of difference between long and short. And this stayed at 5 months because we shipped these laptops back to people and asked them, okay, you did this in the lab, please do this again. We'll pay you. And only this, while it's a significant effect at the group level, we only found this for people who maintained some daily meditation practice. This effect went away if you just went out of the retreat and didn't meditate. But what's really cool is that it replicated in the second retreat. When you invert this task and now you say, press the button every single time you see a long line, 90% of the time, but when you see a short line, don't press. Withhold. Well, that's a very interesting kind of task. That's an executive control task where you need to overcome a habitual response pattern. Well, combining the groups from both retreats, there was this decrement in the ability to sustain attention to this response inhibition. And by the midpoint, it got better, and it got significantly better at the group level. So they were able to keep overcoming the habitual tendency to press the button even when it was the short line. But there's a really interesting fact here, and this is work by Baljinder Sadra, Catherine McLean, and a bunch of our colleagues. I have this extraordinary team. To the extent that a single individual improved on this task between the beginning and the middle of the retreat, it predicted their adaptive psychological functioning that we talked about at the beginning. Here is a low-level, boring cognitive task that is quantitatively related and predictive of self-report adapted psychological function. And how do we know that? With this very simple statistical model. We have 2 episodes of, don't worry, I'm not going through this. These are the self-report adaptive functioning measures, and these are the pre, mid, and post performance on the response inhibition. This you can read about in Emotion. We also looked at brain activity. Manish Shigar, who's now a postdoc at Stanford, but did his dissertation in computer science on brainwave data from the Shambhala project. There are not that many folks who are in computer science who do dissertations on meditation, EEG data. But in the short of it, what this figure shows is for the first retreat and the second retreat, and not for the control group, there is a significant decrease during mindfulness of breathing of beta activity. That's activity between about 11 and 20 cycles per second in the EEG activity. And this pattern overlies regions involved in attention, in spatial orienting, parietal attention, frontal attention regions. So our interpretation is that with training, there was more recruitment of attention-related brain regions. That's really not remarkable. That's what you would expect. But it's always nice in this field to get what you expect, even if it's pretty straightforward. It's not straightforward to do the data analysis. So, in the remaining few minutes, what about emotion? We expect people, they may become more calm, less reactive. There's this notion, this is a phrase often used by Mathieu Ricard. You have an eliciting event, a spark, and then if you have a full-blown emotional reaction due to it, somebody really pisses you off, you now have gone from spark to flame. Now, it's possible through contemplative practice that you can become aware of the internal dynamics. You may not catch the spark, but if you pay careful attention, time will slow down, and you can see that the spark might die out, or it might kindle. And this transient differences in mind states might be what it is that differentiates whether you go full on or you actually allow the moment to pass. or actually whether you allow is the wrong phrase, whether passing of the moment occurs. Let's take you out of it. If you have that space, you may be able to choose a different course of action and withhold hurtful words instead of button presses. You can also change the type of emotion that arises. So we expected decreased rejection of suffering, decreased contempt, anger, and disgust in response to the perception of human suffering. Hopefully in preparation for a compassionate response. So I'm going to quickly go through physiological responses to images of suffering. I'm going to say I'm just trying to edit the time here. So we look at this startle response, and we look at facial expressions. And we present positive, neutral, and negative images. Here are, I'm warning you, actually I didn't warn you, but these are images from the International Affective Picture Set. These are images of illness, starvation, injury that we present. We present a very loud tone, and your emotional response to these pictures increases the degree to which you have a startle response to a loud tone. We also have images that are threatening. So these are some images of threat. And we asked whether or not the training differentially affected, this is work by Brandon King, who's a graduate student in the lab, Tony Zanesco. And we asked whether or not the startle magnitude is different to suffering versus threat. And it is. So this is the retreat group in the first retreat. After training, they have an increased startle response to suffering, but they have no change in response to threat. The control group has no change pre to post in response to suffering, but they actually have an increased response to threat. So I'm going to skip cardiac changes and move directly to what I kind of want to finish up on. I'm going to show you a difficult movie. It's an excerpt from a documentary about the Iraq War. And one of the things that we've done is we've looked at facial expression in individuals as they see this movie. So this is about 2 minutes. Can I have like 5 minutes, Maria, after? Oh, it's okay? We're just like, the sponsor has withdrawn their ad, so.
Happens and the fighting starts, it's kind of like we're pumped up, motivated, ready to go.
It's the ultimate rush because you're going into the fight to begin with, and then you got a good song playing in the background, and that gets you real fired up, ready to do the job.
You can hook your CD player up to the tank's internal communication Charlie box, so that way when you put your helmet on, you can hear it through the helmet.
This is the one we listen to the most. This is the one we try when we kill the enemy. Johnny Pool at the body hit the floor is just fitting for the job we were doing. because we're not.
Who's the enemy?
This was a lot more real and true than just a video game. A lot of people thought it was just me, oh yeah, look through the sight and shoot. No. A lot of this is face-to-face, and especially riding by after some of the bombs have went off and seeing all the people on the side of the road bloated up and just all the smells around you. I mean, from the people lying dead, rotted, and it's a lot more gruesome than you think.
We called in with some artillery and some napalm and things like that. Some innocent women and children got hit. We met them on the road, and they had little girls with noses blowing off, and like husbands carrying their dead wives and things like that. That was extremely difficult to deal with because you're like, shoot.
So imagine you've just spent 3 months cultivating compassion, the wish for others to be free from suffering. We bring you in. We show you this. How do you hold it? Of course, that's a question I'm asking in real time as well. So, these numbers on the screen represent 12 seconds of facial coding. This work is spearheaded by Erica Rosenberg, who is an emotion researcher and a meditation teacher and a student of Paul Ekman and the world teacher now of the facial action coding system that Wally Friesen and Paul developed many years ago. And Brandon and Tony are part of our dream team of coders, because what you need to do is you need to look every single frame of video and code the position, the 44 different muscle groups on the face, when their position changes, the peak of their contraction, when the muscle relaxes. Frame by frame. This takes 150 times real time. So it's a good day's work. Talk about sustained attention tasks to code just a few minutes of material. And we've done this for 29 individuals who were in the first retreat and 29 in the control group. And you get these facial expression action units here and their intensity of contraction in these letters, their onset, peak, and offset times. And then you can put them together when they co-occur in close temporal proximity into what's called an emotion dictionary. And you can come up with actual putative emotions that a person is feeling by this analysis. That is just a objective spatiotemporal map of facial movements. So we found, before the retreat, trainee and control groups did not differ in how likely they were to show sadness. The film we showed at the beginning of the retreat was a painful excerpt of the movie Crash. I'm not going to subject you to that film. And the films were quite different. In the second retreat, we showed similar films at the beginning and end. So the control and retreat group did not differ on how likely they were to show sadness or the number of sadness expressions. After the retreat, trainees, the retreatants, were more likely to show sadness, which is what we predicted. But they did not differ on the number of sadness expressions if they showed sadness. So there was 50% of the subjects showed sadness in the retreat group versus 20% in the control group. And that was statistically significant given individual variability. What about a rejection emotion? Again, before the retreat, the control group and the retreat group did not differ in how likely they were to show rejection emotions, anger, contempt, or disgust, or the number of them. After the retreat, the trainees were equally as likely to show these emotions, but if they did show these emotions, they showed significantly fewer of these expressions. So we're now going to replicate this in the second retreat with several thousand more hours of coding, given that we have support from the Templeton grant. These results suggest that an increased ability to hold in mind complex and painful realities without pushing them away may be one of the fruits of practice. And this may be the crucible for the arising of compassion when confronted with the suffering of others. We also ask people how they felt during the film using this storyboard. And self-reports during expressions of sadness in the retreat group, trainees reported, they didn't report more sadness when they showed what we thought was sadness. They reported more sympathy, more distress, but not more sadness. There was no relationship between self-report in the control group and the expressions of sadness. So these findings throw into question the meaning of the sadness that we were seeing. This may be a marker for the growth of empathic concern and other-directed emotion. Again, perhaps on the way to the cultivation of compassion. So in the last moment, I'm going to just talk about an effort that Baljinder Sadra has been invested in with Susan Bauer-Wu and other colleagues that complement all these empirical laboratory measurements. How do we get at these deeper questions of meaning, values, worldview, and goals? And can we relate the value that people get from the training in their own lives to what we measure in the laboratory? So we conducted in the second retreat 99 videotaped interviews. We're using a method called grounded theory thematic analysis, where basically you transcribe these interviews and you code every time a person, their responses to simple questions, what are your goals? What do you expect to get out of this? What's it like to meditate? What's it like to be a subject in a scientific experiment? What are the challenges that you experience? And we came up with, this is 2 years, another Talmudic exercise. I guess my cultural roots get expressed in Talmudic research efforts. Baljinder and Susan Bauer-Wu and another individual, Rachel Whitworth, came up with 38 primary nodes and 138 secondary nodes, different themes. Themes like tolerance, commitment to practice, physical discomfort, compassion, non-attachment, going with the flow. People reported lots of psychological challenges, lots of positive experiences, and we can quantify these things. So here, there's more mention. This is a graph that shows this is how many people did not mention compassion in their interviews, pre, mid, and post. And the number of people who didn't mention it goes down, and there are more mentions of compassion at the end of the retreat. There are many more instances of speaking about insights. And there is an increase in a sense of letting go, and there's no change in a sense of commitment to practice. That is to say, despite the challenges, despite the difficulties, people kept on, keeping on. So, if I were going to leave you with a take-home, I'm going to let one of our participants say it for us. This is about acceptance. One of the things that this person said they learned. Well, the biggest frame, most of the time, is my sense of this world is unfolding perfectly. Not that I always like how it's unfolding, but I don't tend to question what's unfolding. You can have all kinds of positive responses to what's unfolding, but saying, I can't believe this is happening, might not be one of them. So I am the orchestra conductor, but I have a village of collaborators and extraordinary talent behind this work. And they also have maintained a commitment that has been unwavering over time. which is why I can still talk about new things at these talks, and much more to come in the coming years. So I want to highlight Alan, who is our collaborator in thinking about all the things we might want to measure, and the trainer and involved in this work in the long haul. And Baljinder Sadra now at the University of Sydney is my co-principal investigator on the latest leg of this journey. And of course our remarkable and generous funders. And I'm sorry to have taken so much time, but I have gotten to the end.